I thought my wedding day would be the most important day of my life. The one day my family would put everything else aside. I had no idea my parents had already booked a ski resort for my brother's birthday trip, scheduled for the exact same weekend, and that my own husband had known about it for 3 weeks before he said a single word to me. Their seats were empty during my first dance. My brother texted a photo from the slopes at exactly the moment I was cutting the cake. And the only reason I didn't collapse in the middle of the dance floor was because Jake, my brand new husband, the man I had just vowed to trust with my entire life, finally broke his silence and told me everything, every last detail of the plan my parents had kept from me, and that he had kept from me, and that had been quietly unraveling for months while I arranged flowers and confirmed catering orders, and believed, with a ferocity that embarrasses me now, that my family loved me enough to show up. My name is Clara, and I grew up understanding, in the quiet and unspoken way that children do, that I was the second priority, not unloved. I want to be clear about that, because for a long time I couldn't even admit it to myself. My parents loved me, but they loved Daniel differently. Daniel was the youngest, the son, the one with my mother's blue eyes and my father's athletic build, and an easy charm that made strangers smile at him in grocery stores. He had been a competitive skier since he was 12, and my parents had structured their entire social calendar around his competitions for the better part of a decade. Every weekend from November through March belonged to Daniel. Every vacation was planned around his races or his training camps or the regional qualifiers my parents attended with the kind of focused devotion most people reserve for religion. I had learned early not to schedule anything important during ski season. Not birthday dinners, not graduation ceremonies, not, as it turned out, weddings. My wedding was in February. I know what that sounds like. But when Jake and I got engaged, I was so certain this time was different, that this was the one event my parents could not rationalize their way out of. A wedding isn't a school recital. A wedding isn't even a college graduation, which my parents had technically attended by leaving my ceremony early to drive 2 hours for Daniel's regional qualifier. A wedding is permanent, singular, and unrepeatable. It marks the before and the after of a life. And I was their daughter, and I truly, deeply believed that this would be the time they chose me. Jake and I had been together 4 years when he proposed in Rocky Mountain National Park, where he had carried the ring in his jacket pocket for 4 uphill miles without giving a single thing away. We met at our firm's holiday party, discovered we both thought the shrimp cocktail was the only redeemable feature of the buffet, and spent the rest of the evening in a corner talking about everything except work. He was thoughtful, calm, and faintly serious in a way I found inexplicably attractive. He drove 2 hours in a snowstorm to meet my parents for the first time, brought my mother peonies, her favorite, which I had mentioned exactly once months earlier, and called my father Sir without being sycophantic about it. My parents liked Jake. Jake seemed to genuinely like them, which I found both touching and faintly alarming, because truly knowing my family required a suspension of critical judgment that not everyone could sustain. We booked the venue in September, a restored farmhouse with wooden beams and a stone fireplace, and a barn strung with thousands of warm white lights, so that standing inside it at night felt like being suspended in a constellation. We sent save the dates in October. My parents RSVP'd yes within 2 days. My mother sent a handwritten card on cream paper, careful cursive, a small heart next to her signature. I called her immediately. She asked about the flowers, the seating chart, whether Daniel could bring his girlfriend. It was the kind of phone call I had been waiting my whole life to have with her. warm, easy, entirely focused on me, and I hung up feeling something I was not familiar with when it came to my family: uncomplicated, unguarded hope. The first crack appeared in November. I smoothed it over before I could really look at it. My mother called to ask, very casually, whether I would consider moving the wedding to early March. She said it the way you mention a preference for a different restaurant, lightly, without urgency. Daniel's regional qualifier was on February 14th, and she didn't want him to have to choose. I told her the date was set in every possible way. Deposit paid, invitations sent, vendors booked, guests with non-refundable flights already purchased. She said, of course. Of course, Clara. She said it the way people say it when they've already decided the real conversation belongs to a more convenient moment, when you're less prepared and more likely to yield. In December, my mother raised it again. The framing had grown more elaborate. Daniel had been invited to an elite training camp in Vail the week before the wedding. Prestigious program, former Olympic coaches on staff, and it would be such a shame if he had to cut it short. The way she said, "such a shame," made clear the shame she envisioned was mine for choosing an inconvenient date, not hers. I said again that the date was not changing. She said, of course. I noticed Jake was very still during that call. We were in the kitchen, the phone on speaker, and when I hung up, he was staring at his laptop with an expression I couldn't categorize. Not surprised, not concerned, something more deliberate. The face of a man maintaining a carefully constructed neutral. "She'll come around," he said before I could speak. "She's been saying this for 2 months," I said. "She'll come around," he said again, as though repetition were a form of evidence. He smiled, warm, certain, the smile of a man who genuinely believed what he was saying or had practiced believing it long enough that the difference had become irrelevant. I let it go. January was where the fractures became too large to press flat. My mother called less. When she did, her voice had that quality I recognized from childhood, a slight holding back, a brightness one register too high, the vocal equivalent of painting over a stain rather than scrubbing it out. My father went almost entirely silent. Jake started sleeping badly. He had always been a reliable sleeper, but suddenly he was restless at 2 a.m, lying in the dark with his eyes open in a way that made the room feel pressurized. I asked twice if something was wrong. Both times, a work deadline, nothing serious. The second time, he said it 3 seconds too quickly, and I felt something cold and precise move through the center of my chest. Not suspicion exactly, more like the awareness of a word-shaped silence where something should have been said weeks ago. 3 weeks before the wedding, I found the email by accident. I want to be precise about that word because I have turned it over many times since. I was not snooping. I was using Jake's laptop, mine was charging in the bedroom, to confirm a vendor payment for the catering deposit. Jake's email was open on the browser. He had forgotten to close it when he stepped out for a phone call. I wasn't trying to read anything. My hand was reaching for the new tab icon, but the subject line of the most recent unread message was visible in the preview pane before I could look away. It said, February 14th. Final decision. The sender was my father. I sat very still. The kitchen was quiet except for the refrigerator's low, even hum, a sound I had never consciously noticed before and would never be able to unhear again. Outside, snow was falling in the particular silent way it does in Colorado in January, muffling everything until the world felt sealed and pressureless, like the inside of something that has been closed for a very long time. My hands rested on the keyboard. I was aware of them in a distant clinical way, as though they belonged to a body I was observing from slightly above. I clicked the email open. I read it once quickly, the words not quite registering, like text in a dream. Then I read it again, slowly, with the sick precision of someone examining a wound they are not yet ready to name. The thread went back 6 weeks. 6 weeks of correspondence between my father and my husband, conducted through a personal email address I had never seen Jake use, entirely separate from the account we shared for household logistics. My father's messages were brief and businesslike, stripped of warmth by his lifelong preference for efficiency. Jake's responses were longer and more careful, full of the measured language of a man trying to hold two incompatible truths in the same grip without either of them cutting him. The substance was this. Daniel's ski camp ended February 13th. His coach, a former Olympic trainer whose approval my parents treated as a form of divine endorsement, had told them Daniel had a realistic shot at a national junior qualifier this season, and that any interruption to his training momentum could compromise his preparation. My parents had decided sometime in late November that they would not be attending my wedding. They would drive Daniel to a resort 2 hours north for his team's pre-qualifier retreat instead. They had booked rooms, made dinner reservations. In one email from early December, my father had referred to the conflict as unfortunate but clear-cut. My mother had added a line at the bottom in her handwriting, as though she had been standing over his shoulder. Clara will understand. She always does. They had told Jake in the second week of December and asked him not to tell me until after the new year, so as not to ruin the holidays. Jake had agreed. I read the thread a third time. The refrigerator hummed. The snow fell. My face was very cold, which was strange because the heat was on, and then I understood that the cold was entirely internal. A temperature that had nothing to do with the thermostat and everything to do with what was happening in the center of my chest, which was not quite grief and not quite rage, but something that contained both of them, the way a winter sky contains darkness and light in the hour before one of them wins. Jake came back into the kitchen while I was still at his laptop. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at my face. He looked at the screen. He said nothing for a moment that stretched long enough to contain everything that needed to be said and several things that didn't. "How long?" I said. My voice surprised me with its evenness. "Since December," he said. "How long?" I said again because I needed him to say the number. 6 weeks, he said quietly. Almost 6 weeks. I closed the laptop carefully, the way you handle something you are trying not to break, and I looked at my husband, this man I was marrying in 3 weeks, this man I had trusted with the weight of my history and the shape of my future. He was standing in the doorway in his gray sweater with his hands slightly open at his sides, and he looked like a man who had been waiting a long time for a door to open, and was not entirely relieved now that it finally had. "You let me plan a wedding," I said, while knowing my parents weren't coming. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the floor between us. "I was going to tell you," he said. "I kept thinking maybe they'd change their minds. I thought if I just waited a little longer, maybe something would shift." "You thought," I said quietly, "that you would decide for me how much of my own life I was allowed to know about." He didn't answer. The silence between us was the loudest thing in the room, and the snow outside kept falling, and the refrigerator kept humming, and the life I had been so carefully building felt, for the first time, like something I had built on someone else's foundation. We didn't speak for the rest of that evening. Jake made dinner. Pasta, something simple, The kind of meal you make when your hands need something to do and your mouth has nothing left to offer. I sat at the kitchen table and watched him move between the stove and the counter and thought, with a clarity that felt almost pharmaceutical in its precision, about every moment over the past 6 weeks when he had kissed me good morning, listened to me agonize over centerpieces, held my hand in the car on the way home from the venue walkthrough and said it was going to be perfect. He had sat with me while I addressed envelopes. He had asked if I wanted the white roses or the ivory ones. He had stood in our kitchen and smiled and kept the thing that would have broken me at a careful, loving distance, and called it protection. I ate the pasta. It tasted like nothing. I went to bed before he did and lay in the dark listening to him wash the dishes, the clink of glass against glass, the ordinary domestic sound of a life that had, without my knowledge, been tilting for weeks. In the morning, I called my mother. She picked up on the second ring, her voice bright and slightly too ready. The voice of someone who has rehearsed their opening line. "Clara, sweetheart," she started. I said very calmly, "I found the email thread." There was a pause, not long, maybe 2 seconds, but a pause that contained an entire recalibration, the sound of a person shifting from one prepared script to another. "We were going to explain everything after the new year," she said. "It is after the new year," I said. "It's 3 weeks before my wedding." A longer pause. Then, in a different register, softer, the voice she used when she was about to say something she knew would land badly. "Sweetheart, this isn't about choosing Daniel over you. This is about a window that won't come again. His coach says this qualifier could change everything for him." "Mom," I said, "I need you to hear what you're saying." She was quiet. "You're telling me a ski qualifier is a window that won't come again, and my wedding is not." She didn't answer. I could hear my father's voice in the background and my mother saying, "Just a minute," in the half-covered way people do when they don't want both conversations to bleed together. "We'll have a dinner after," she said finally. "We'll celebrate with you properly, I promise." "I have to go," I said, and I hung up before she could answer. I stood in the bathroom with my phone and looked at my own face in the mirror for a long moment. I looked very calm. I found this alarming. People who feel this calm, I knew from experience, are usually storing something they haven't yet found the container for. I called Mara. She had been my maid of honor for 4 months and had heard every iteration of the Daniel problem and had always, with characteristic patience, talked me back from the edge of assuming the worst. When I finished telling her about the email, she was silent for 5 full seconds. I counted. And then she said, "Clara, that is not okay." She said it the way a doctor says that needs to come out. Not unkindly, but without room for negotiation. She told me I needed to think about what I wanted the wedding to look like, and then separately about what I wanted my life after the wedding to look like, and that those were 2 different questions that both deserved real answers. She was right. She was always right. I told her I'd call her back. I held her words like a compass I wasn't ready to use yet. The 2 weeks that followed were the strangest of my life. Jake and I moved through the house in a new and careful choreography, not hostile, not cold, but precise in the way of people who know one wrong step could break something not yet ready to break. He apologized twice. The second apology was better, slower, meeting my eyes instead of the floor with less qualification. "I thought I was protecting you," he said. "That's not what protection looks like." I said. "I know," he said. "I know that now." I believed him. I also understood In a way, I was still assembling into full sentences that believing him didn't automatically repair the thing that had been done. My parents did not call again before the wedding. 2 days before the ceremony, Daniel sent a cheerful text. "Can't wait to celebrate when you're back from the honeymoon." I stared at it for a long time before understanding something I had been circling without landing on. Daniel had known too. He was 23 years old. He knew what a wedding was. He had said nothing. No call, no, "I'm sorry, our things are conflicting," because he had grown up in the same family I had and absorbed the same lesson I was supposed to have absorbed, that his calendar was the one that mattered. I said nothing to Jake about this. I was saving it. The wedding was both the most beautiful and most brutal day of my life. The farmhouse looked exactly as we had imagined. Warm lights, white flowers, the fireplace lit. The January sky a deep luminous navy through the windows by the time the ceremony started. Mara held my bouquet and kept looking at me with an expression that asked, without words, "Are you all right?" I kept nodding. Jake cried during his vows. I had not expected that. He stood in his dark suit, and when he began to speak, his voice broke on the third word, and he stopped, pressed his lips together, breathed, and then said the rest of it quietly, looking only at me, with no performance in it whatsoever. I said my own vows without my voice breaking. I had always been good, in the way of people who grew up as the second priority, at finding footing in difficult terrain. The reception was full and warm and alive. People danced. Mara's toast made half the room cry and the other half laugh, which is the only kind worth making. And my parents' table sat empty. 2 chairs with folded napkins and untouched wine glasses. A small and precise absence that everyone politely pretended not to notice, and that I felt every time I glanced at it like a hand pressed flat against my sternum. Jake found me near the barn doors sometime after midnight. The party floated behind us, warm and distant. He took my hand and said quietly, "I need to tell you everything, not just the email, everything." I looked at him. "Okay," I said. He had not only known about my parents' decision, he had spent 2 weeks in December actively trying to change it. 3 calls to my father, a long email to my mother laying out plainly and earnestly what it would mean to me if they weren't there. My father had replied with 2 sentences. "We've made our decision. Please don't make this harder on everyone." My mother had not replied at all, and then Jake told me the part I hadn't seen coming. Daniel had called him directly in the 3rd week of December. He had called to say he hoped Jake wasn't going to be weird about this, that it was just one day, that Clara had always been kind of sensitive about the whole family thing. He said it with the easy certainty of someone who has been told their whole life that their preferences are the highest priority in every room, and has simply never developed the imagination to understand they are not. I stood against the cold barn door with the sound of my wedding behind me and felt very precisely the thing that had been building in my chest for 6 weeks finally find its shape. It wasn't grief. It wasn't the hot kind of rage. It was something colder and more structural. The feeling of a person who has stood in a tilted room their entire life and has only just in this exact moment understood that the floor was never level to begin with, and that she has been the only one compensating for it all along, alone. "Why didn't you tell me any of this?" I said. "Because I kept thinking I could fix it," Jake said. "I thought if I tried hard enough, your parents would do the right thing and you'd never have to know they almost didn't." He looked at me with no deflection in his face, None of the careful neutrality that had cost us both so much. I was wrong to make that choice for you. I'm going to spend a long time making it right, if you'll let me. I didn't answer immediately. I thought about what Mara had said. 2 separate questions. The wedding question had been answered. The life after question was still open, and it was the one that mattered most. I need you to never decide for me what I can handle, I said. I won't, he said. I promise you. I believed him. The truth without the softening is the only kind worth anything, and this was the truth without the softening. The morning after the wedding, I called my parents from the parking lot before we drove to the airport. My mother answered. I told her I needed to say some things and that I needed her to listen. I told her that her note in the email, "Clara will understand, she always does," was not a compliment, that it was a description of a dynamic that had cost me more than she knew, and that I was no longer willing to treat my own accommodation as a virtue. I told her I loved her and that I would not be speaking to either of them for a while, not as punishment, but because I needed the distance to decide what kind of relationship I was willing to have and on what terms. She cried. I let her. I said goodbye and hung up and stood in the cold parking lot with my chest wide open and thought, there it is. That's what it feels like to say the true thing. It didn't feel good exactly. It felt honest, which was better and harder and more durable than good. I sent Daniel a text. Brief. I told him I knew he'd called Jake, that his assessment of my sensitivity was noted, and that I'd reach out when I was ready. He responded with a question mark. I didn't reply. The 3 months that followed were the hardest and most clarifying of my life. Jake and I went to couples counseling. His idea, which mattered. We talked about what he had done and why, and about the patterns I had brought into our marriage and named too late. I went to my own therapist on alternate weeks and talked about Clara before the wedding in the past tense, which turned out to be one of the most useful things I had ever done. My parents reached out several times. My father sent 2 emails. Careful, genuine, slightly stiff in the way his feelings always were when they didn't have a procedure to follow. My mother's voicemails grew slowly more honest until in April she left one that said only, I think I have known for a long time that we made Daniel the center in a way that wasn't fair to you. I didn't want to look at it directly. I'm looking at it now. I listened to it 4 times. I didn't call back that day, but I saved it and I have it still. We had dinner in May, my parents, Jake, and me. My father shook Jake's hand and said, without theater, I handled this wrong. 4 words. For my father, that was an aria. We ate. We talked carefully, then less carefully. Nothing was resolved in the way of movies, no declaration, no clean slate. What happened was smaller and more durable, a beginning, a collective decision to look at the tilt in the floor and try for the first time to level it. Now it is a different February. Jake and I drove back out to the farmhouse, not for any occasion, just because we both wanted to. The barn was empty and cold and unlit, the string lights taken down for the off-season, and we stood inside it anyway. The stone floor was solid underfoot. The beams smelled of timber and cold winter air. Jake stood beside me with his shoulder touching mine and said nothing for a long while. And I thought about the woman who had stood here a year ago, still in her wedding dress, holding the knowledge of what her family had done, deciding whether the floor was solid enough to hold her weight. It was. It had been the whole time. The ground was never the problem. Only the story I had told myself about it. That love which makes you the second priority is love you have to accept. That the tilt is just how floors are. I know now that floors can be made level, that it takes work and honesty and the willingness to say the true thing even when the true thing costs something. That it is possible, even after everything, to stand somewhere solid and call it home. I took Jake's hand. We walked back out into the snow. The world was white and quiet and entirely, irrevocably ours.